Hey everyone, welcome to Judging for the Win. I'm Dave and this is my daily ruling. Today is this month's patron pick, and the topic that was chosen is historical rulings that have changed. Now, I made a couple of other videos where I talked about similar topics, so if you're interested in this sort of historical content, I definitely recommend that you check them out. I have one where I go over all of the most significant changes to Magic's rules throughout the years, and I have another one where I go over all of the significant changes to Magic's policy documents. This video is going to kind of be a hybrid between those two. When I say rulings that have changed, I mean specific interactions between specific cards where the result has changed due to some difference in Magic's rules or policy or some other thing that happened in Magic's history. Ready? Let's get started. So I chose my favorite 10 of these because, I like top 10s. Top 10 is a good number. So there's going to be the 10 most significant ones that I could think of. And if I left out your favorite, definitely leave it in the comments because I had a lot of fun making this video and I would love to make a part 2 sometime. Okay, so the first one that I'm going to be talking about is related to how land plays work. So it used to be that whenever you played a land, you specifically had to keep track of what effect it was that was letting you play that land, whether it was your normal land for the turn, or whether it was some bonus land drop that you got as a result of some other effect, like what you see on Azusa Lost But Seeking. So that would mean that if you played 2 lands with Azusa Lost But Seeking and then flickered it, then it would be a completely new Azusa Lost But Seeking and it would be giving you 2 completely new land plays. So you could use your 2 land plays with Azusa and then flicker it and then play 2 more additional lands and then just play the land for your turn, and so you'd get a bunch of land drops using this technique. Another consequence of this is the reverse was also true, which is that if you had an Azusa, you had to be really careful to say that you were using your extra land drops for the first 2 lands that you played, so that if your opponent had a lightning bolt, you would still have your normal land drop for the turn that was still available to you. Now, what has changed with this interaction? Well, now the rule looks a little bit something like this. So in order to determine whether a player can play a land, you compare the number of lands the player can play this turn with the number of lands that they already played. And that is what you do to determine whether a land play is legal or not. So Azusa will only be giving you 2 bonus lands. It's not going to be possible to flicker the Azusa and get 2 more bonus lands because you only still have 1 Azusa in play. So when the game is counting up how many total land plays you have available, it's going to get 3 both before and after the flicker effect. And so it's not going to be giving you any additional ones. Also, if you lightning bolt the Azusa, you don't have to specifically worry about whether you played a land with the Azusa ability or not. It doesn't matter what effect it was that was letting you play the lands that you already played this turn, because anytime you play a subsequent land, what you do is you look at how many land plays you have available at that moment, and you compare that to the number of lands that you have already played in that turn. So in that case, it doesn't matter whether you were playing the land first with your Azusa ability or with your normal land plays for the turn, the answer is always going to be the same to that question, which is that after the lightning bolt has killed the Azusa, then you are not going to have an additional land play available during that turn, and so that means you would not be able to make that land play. Okay, so the next one that I'm going to be talking about would be this one here, the combat shortcut. So who can tell me the difference in between this at the beginning of combat ability on Goblin Rabblemaster here and this one on Surik the Hunt Caller? And if you said that Surik has an intervening if clause in its ability, well, that's true, but that's not actually the answer that we're looking for here. Specifically, there is a difference in between these 2 triggered abilities, and it has to do with the title slide here, that is the combat shortcut. So, who here has ever played a game of Magic and said something like, go to combat? Right? Probably most people, because that's how most people typically play. They don't specifically pass priority in order to get to where the combat phase is. They'll use some shortcuts. And one of the specifically defined shortcuts in Magic's rules used to say that if you were to say something like go to combat or something similar to that, well, that would mean that you are offering to pass priority up until the point where your opponent has priority during the beginning of combat step. So I know that that was a lot of really technical mumbo-jumbo rule speak, so I'll try and break things down in the way that kind of highlights what's relevant about it for this interaction here. So when your opponent has priority at the beginning of combat step, that would be the very first step in the combat phase, and it's the very first time that you could pass priority after having left your main phase. So why is that important for these triggered abilities here? Well, it turns out that the missed trigger policy at the time, and still in effect now really, says that in order to count as being missed, you have to be progressed past the point in the game where the triggered ability would have first gotten a visible impact on the game. So that would mean that if I said go to combat and I had a Goblin Rabblemaster, then I'm going to keep passing priority until my opponent has priority at the beginning of combat. Now, the interesting thing about that is that the triggered ability from Goblin Rabblemaster would still be on the stack at that point, because at the time when my opponent first gets priority during the combat phase, well, that would be at the time when the first Goblin Rabblemaster triggered ability, it's still on the stack. It triggers during the beginning of combat phase, and my opponent would have a chance to respond to that triggered ability, and that would be the first time my opponent gets to act. So if I said go to combat when I had a Goblin Rabblemaster, I would not have forgotten my triggered ability. It's all good. And if my opponent said, okay, you can go to combat, I would be perfectly within my rights to get a Goblin token out of my deck box, put it on the battlefield, and say, I'm attacking with this also. Now, when we take a look at the Surk the Hunt Caller's ability, it has a slight difference in that it targets a creature, and that is very important because targeting a creature is something you do when the triggered ability gets put onto the stack, and therefore this triggered ability affects the visible game state a little bit before Goblin Rabblemaster's does. Goblin Rabblemaster's only affects the visible game state once it resolves. However, Surak's affects the visible game state at the time when the target happens, which is when the triggered ability goes on the stack. Which means that if I say go to combat when I have a Surak out, then my opponent could say, okay, that's fine. And then if I tried to say that my creature is getting haste until end of turn, well, that would be too bad for me because I already missed that trigger. Now, this is pretty rough, and there was another really important situation where this would come up, which would be when you wanted to attack with a manland or like a vehicle. And so then if you said something like go to combat, then that would mean that you're passing priority up until the point where your opponent has priority at the beginning of combat step. And then your opponent could just say, okay, we're going to combat. And because both players have passed priority now in succession with no stack, that would mean that we're going to immediately progress to the next step in the game, which is the Declare Attacker step. Now, once we're in the Declare Attacker step, it's actually too late to activate a manland or a vehicle to be able to have you be able to attack with it this turn. So that would mean that if you say go to combat carelessly when you have a permanent like this out, then that might mean that you're forfeiting your opportunity to attack with it that turn. So what's changed? Well, here is the current version of that combat shortcut. If the active player passes priority with an empty stack during their first main phase, the non-active player is assumed to be acting in the beginning of combat unless they're affecting whether a beginning of combat ability triggers. So if I were to say go to combat and I had that Goblin Rabblemaster from earlier and my opponent played a Doomblade against the Goblin Rabblemaster, then that would be affecting whether a beginning of combat ability triggers. And so that would mean that my opponent would be assumed to be acting during my main phase, not during my combat phase. If my opponent didn't specifically say otherwise, that would be the default assumption. And so that's important because it makes it so that you can't shark someone by having them make that play without saying any words and trying to get a Goblin token afterwards. Because, oh, you know, maybe it's possible legally that you could have played that Doomblade with my triggered ability already on the stack, when it's obviously clear that that's not what was going to happen. Okay, then after all those actions resolve, or no actions take place, the active player receives priority at the beginning of combat. So this is very important because now the active player has not passed their priority at the beginning of combat, which is what the original shortcut would have stipulated. And so what that means is it would be possible to activate a vehicle or a manland at this time. And then beginning of combat triggered abilities, even ones that target, can be announced at this time. So you see that the triggered abilities are specifically called out, and it specifically lets you put triggered abilities, even ones that target, on the stack. Now, I can't tell you how many people argued about this on forums. It was a lot, and there was a lot of people who was really dissatisfied with all of the aspects that I discussed about the combat shortcut and ways that it led to a bunch of angle shooting and a bunch of rules lawyering to try and get some edge on your opponent. I think the current iteration of the shortcut is working really well now, and there hasn't been any kind of issues that I can tell from people scumbagging their opponent or else from people using this shortcut to create ambiguity in the game that helps them to angle shoot or do something that wouldn't normally be allowed if everybody was playing 100% precisely. So in my mind, this is a really good shortcut, and I think that the changes that they made did a really great job of addressing all of the issues that we were actually seeing in tournament practice. All right, so the next topic that we're going to be covering is casting spells. And maybe you've heard of this story. There was a player at the second Pro Tour, I believe it was, in Los Angeles, and he was a really good Magic player, name of David Mills. And one thing that you got to know about David Mills is when he learned how to play Magic, all the people in his play group, they would put the spell on the table first and then tap mana for it. And so that was exactly what he was doing throughout the Pro Tour. Now, it turns out that officially at the time, which again was very early in Magic's history, it turns out officially that was not how it worked. And officially, you had to actually have the mana in your mana pool before you announced that you were casting the spell. And so, you know, it's kind of a ticky-tack little rule, a little bit of a procedural thing. There's not really a way that you could gain an advantage from breaking that rule, unless you were able to somehow sneak by a spell where you didn't have the correct amount of mana for it. But in that case, you would be able to break the rule the exact same way if you would have followed the procedure correctly. Okay, so what's the deal here? Well, David was having a lot of trouble remembering to do these things in the right order. And throughout the tournament, he got a number of interactions with the judge where he was getting in trouble for doing these things in the wrong order. And so it started off with you know, please play more carefully, and then it got to a more serious warning, and then it got to like an even more serious warning until eventually David Mills gets into the finals, and the judge has told him that if he commits this infraction again, he will be disqualified. And so I'm sure that the punchline to the story is pretty much tells itself after I made that statement. And yes, indeed, in the Game 4 of the best-of-5 match with him up a game, David Mills top decks a swamp, which he needs to play a black spell in his hand, and plays the swamp, and then windmill slams his black spell before tapping any of his mana. And at that point, the judge did actually disqualify him. Pro players at the time were so outraged that there were actually a number of people who literally stormed the stage during the awards ceremony at the end of the tournament to demand justice for David. And so Wizards took note of how upset people were with this ruling, and they actually changed it. And now, well, they've changed a couple of things. Number one, the first step to casting a spell at present day is actually to take it from whatever zone that it's in, usually your hand, and put it onto the stack. So in fact, the way that David did it was actually correct, and at least based on today's standpoint. So that's the first thing, and the other thing is, of course, that the rules surrounding what you can and cannot be disqualified for has kind of changed and softened their stance a little bit, and we'll get back to a little bit fuller discussion of that in some future slides. But in general, you can't get disqualified for doing something as, meaningless and not able to provide a strategic advantage for you anymore. So that's another story that did actually happen in Magic's very early years. Now, another one that I think probably is a really famous ruling, especially because of a similar similar flavor to the previous story, where it has some big time potential for some feel bads, would be this missed triggers with default actions. So it used to be that in the missed trigger policy in Magic, that if you had a triggered ability that stipulated a default action, such as, for example, sacrifice this creature unless you, so the sacrificing the creature would be the default action, and then unless you paid 1 would be like, some other choice that you had. Or some ability like this, where at the beginning of your next upkeep, pay this amount of mana, and then if you don't, you lose the game. So it used to be that with triggered abilities, such as these two, if they were missed, they got special handling. And the special handling that they got was that the triggered ability would resolve immediately with the player being assumed to have chosen the default action. And so, of course, with these two specific cards, that was actually extremely punishing. Because, like with the Tabernacle at Pendrell Vale, your creatures would all get destroyed. And with the Pact of the Titan, you would be losing the game unless you happened to have like 4 into red mana just floating in your mana pool at the time when this was discovered. And so with that being the case, both of these were extremely punishing. So what is the ruling now? Well, you don't automatically lose the game, and you don't automatically lose your creature. Instead, for all other triggered abilities, the default, the normal handling of them is if it was missed prior to the current phase in the previous turn, you instruct the players to continue playing. Otherwise, you would be able to have the trigger be put onto the stack. So the opponent would actually choose whether he wanted to put that triggered ability on the stack or not. And of course, they probably would put it on the stack if it were either of those, because having the player lose the game or having the player have to pay 1 to keep their creature alive, those are both things that most people would be interested in having their opponent do. However, it's not going to be the case that this triggered ability just resolves with no input from that player. Rather, that player gets to resolve that triggered ability normally and make the decisions they would normally be able to make, rather than the more harsh situation where the triggered ability just resolves and we pick what the player wanted to do for them. And so I think that this is another good change. Certainly a lot less feel-baddy than the other one. And with not too much more potential for an advantage from accidentally forgetting the triggered abilities. Okay, and this is another one. This is one that I had been hoping for quite a while, actually, and many judges with me, is improperly determining a winner. So, as you may or may not know, but you will definitely know after watching this video, so it is not allowed for players to use a random method, such as flipping a coin or rolling a die, in order to determine the outcome of a game. Doing so is in a competitive rel environment termed improperly determining a winner, and it's against the rules. Don't do that. Now, if you didn't know that that was against the rules and you came from some other trading card games where apparently this sort of practice is commonplace, then that would be pretty embarrassing, right? You would suggest, hey, it's the end of the round. Nobody's going to be able to win, so a draw doesn't help either one of us. What if we just like roll for who gets to win? Right? Pretty innocuous kind of statement, or so you would think. But actually, that sort of thinking was a DQ. It was an automatic DQ with no appeals, no like chances to wiggle out of it. If you made such an offer, that was the end of your tournament for you. And if your opponent did not call a judge immediately, then that would be the same penalty getting handed out to them as well. Okay, so here's the thing. This rule is supposed to be for like tournament integrity purposes, right? Like we're trying to keep so that like the tournaments aren't being decided by blind chance or luck, or I guess bribery. They're being decided based on like Magic player skill. But here's the thing. This rule was not protecting the tournament integrity, because probably 99% of the time, the person who was getting disqualified because of doing this was not a person who is trying to do something shady and disrupt the tournament integrity. It was a 12-year-old kid who was playing his first Magic tournament after playing a bunch of Yu-Gi-Oh! Or Pokemon, which I believe both of those games, correct me if I'm wrong in the comments, had, or at least at one point had, that sort of arrangement as a legal way that you could resolve games. And they thought the same thing would be true in Magic. Well, that was really bad. And judges did, in fact, disqualify a lot of 12-year-old kids over stuff like this. And so eventually enough was enough. And so now we have this new rule. In the IPG, which is the document that governs competitive rules enforcement level events, improperly determining a winner is defined as a player uses or offers to use a method that's not part of the current game, blah, blah, blah. Or they use language designed to trick someone who might not know it's against the rules to make such an offer. So it's not legal for you to say something like, oh boy, a draw doesn't help either one of us. If only we could do something. What could it be? I don't know. So, doing something like that is tantamount to making the offer yourself if you're trying to trick your opponent into making that offer. So if the player was aware that what they were doing was against the rules, then the infraction is not improperly determining winner, it's cheating. So if you intentionally make such an offer knowing that it's against the rules, that would be cheating, and that's a disqualification still. But if you didn't know that it was against the rules, which, again, like we said, 99% of the people who did this did not know it was against the rules, then we would be in improperly determining a winner territory, and the default penalty for that is a match loss, which is still pretty stiff, but at least you're not like sending someone home. The judging the regular rules enforcement level is even lenienter, and it says that intentionally taking any of these actions, which is, this is one of those actions, when the player knows that it's against the rules or trying to trick their opponent into doing so is a serious problem. But without this knowledge that it's against the rules, it's not a serious problem. It's only a generally unwanted behavior. And so that means you could maybe issue someone a game loss for it if you wanted to, but you would probably just be saying, hey, that's not right. You can't do that anymore. So we basically went from a DQ to a caution at regular rel. And I love it because, let me tell you, there aren't a whole lot of feel-bads in the judge world worse than telling a small child that they're actually disqualified from the event for something that they had no idea was even a bad thing to do. Okay, so the next one that we're going to be talking about is this one here, viewing your sideboard. Okay, so let's say that I play a Mindslaver against my opponent, and I then have my opponent play a Coax from the Blind Eternities. Now, I know that my opponent has an Emrakul, the Promised End, in the sideboard, because of course they do. That's what all their decks of whatever archetype they're playing do. I mean, maybe I saw it last game. Here's the thing. I can't look at their sideboard. Now, there was a time in Magic's history when, the Coax from the Blind Eternities would work just fine. I would say, okay, show me your sideboard, and then I would look at their sideboard, and then I would, pick a card out of there. In fact, one of the things that savvy pro players would do when they played the Mindslaver would be to just tell the player, okay, let me see your sideboard, because legally you can look at your sideboard at any time. So yeah, you would be allowed to do that. So that would mean that the person controlling your turn would be able to do that, and so then they would get to know what all the cards in your sideboard were, which could come up if you had some kind of spicy sideboard tech. Or it could come up if there was especially if it was game one and the sideboard tech that they were going to bring in against you hadn't already entered the main deck yet. Okay, so here's the problem. There was no problem. Everybody was perfectly satisfied with how that worked. Everything was perfectly fine, but there was actually one issue, and the issue was that this didn't work right in Moto. So because this did not work in Magic Online and they didn't want to add this functionality into Magic Online, what they did is they changed the rules so that during a game, players can only look at their own sideboard, keeping it clearly distinguishable. And if a player gains control of another player, then they may not look at that player's sideboard, nor may they have that player access their sideboard. This is 100% because the Magic Online developers did not want to implement this feature. I'm kind of annoyed about this because when they announced this change, they tried some kind of they tried to gaslight players into thinking that was how it always was intended to work, and it was never intended that people should be able to Burning Wish and have that card work when they're getting Mindslaver. That doesn't even make any sense. Of course it makes sense. It made sense for several years, but then eventually they came up to a problem that the Magic Online developers didn't want to solve, and so therefore, rather than fixing it in the online world, they fixed it in the rules so that it would no longer work that way. Which brings us to the next one, which also has to do a little bit with Burning Wish. Have you ever looked at Burning Wish and thought to yourself, I wonder why Burning Wish exiles itself? And the level 1, level 0 maybe answer would probably be something like, well, the Burning Wish, you could loop multiples. If you had 2 Burning Wishes, maybe they didn't want you to recur the Burning Wish and play it again. And that's a reasonable idea. It actually, by the way, used to be possible to Burning Wish for a card that was in the exile zone, because the exile zone didn't used to be the exile zone. It used to be removed from the game. And because it was removed from the game, it was actually outside the game, and therefore you could Burning Wish for it. So that's kind of a bonus honorable mention kind of ruling that has changed. But actually, the exile zone becoming part of the game instead of being removed from the game is actually not the reason why the Burning Wish exiles itself. The reason the Burning Wish exiles itself is because at the time when these cards were printed, there was a rule that said if you presented your deck and your sideboard did not have enough cards in it. So like, for example, if you had 61 cards in your main deck and 14 cards in your sideboard, for example, because you played a Burning Wish, put it in your graveyard, and then had an extra card from your sideboard that was moved into your main deck, and then when you sideboarded, you took 5 out and put 5 in, for example, that was a play pattern that seemed like it could be pretty prevalent. And you know what? At the time, when these cards were first printed, that would have been a game loss. Because presenting an illegal number of cards in your sideboard, for example, 14, which again, at the time was a not legal number of cards to be in your sideboard, that was a game loss. And so, there's a couple of changes that apply to this situation that make things a lot cleaner now. First of all, it is legal for your sideboard to have any number of cards up to 15 in constructed formats, of course. So what that means is that if you were to have 14 cards in your sideboard, for example, because your dog ate one of them on your way to the tournament, or you lost one of them somehow else, then it would be perfectly 100% legal and legitimate for you to register a 60-card main deck and a 14-card sideboard. Or even a 3-card sideboard. Maybe there's only like 3 real sideboard cards, and like the rest of them is just for like wusses that can't play Magic without a crutch. I don't know. So now I'll show you what the current situation is here. There's actually only 3 deck problems, 3 very specific situations where a deck problem can get upgraded to a game loss. Philosophically, there's been a gigantic shift that makes it so that much less stuff is a game loss in general. And I go into more detail about that in my History of Magic Policy video that I made a few months ago. But these are the only ones, and I'm not going to read through all of them. You can do that. You can like pause the video and do that if you're really interested in that. But I do want to highlight that basically all of the most common ways that people used to get game loss are no longer a game loss. So for example, if you present 61 cards and 14 cards in your sideboard, not a game loss anymore. If you present 59 cards because you like dropped one on the floor or something, probably not a game loss, only if it's discovered at like very specific times. If you forget to desideboard, that was another thing that the wishes were kind of notorious for, is like failure to desideboard kind of problems, because your sideboard card would be in your main deck. If you forget to decideboard, that is also not a game loss, probably, unless you like see it happen and don't call a judge right away. Obviously, if you know that you have a sideboard card in your deck that you're not supposed to have access to, then you need to call a judge on that right away, or else the infraction might be something a little bit more serious than a game loss. So that is a kind of broad strokes overview, and I have a few videos that are on the channel where I've talked about like all these situations in a little bit more detail. So you can check out my policy and philosophy playlist if you're interested in seeing some more of that. And okay, now this brings us up to this situation. Now, I have to admit up front, this is a little bit of a cheat, because all these other rulings have changed because like there was some change in the like rules and policy documents, but this one is different. So if you take a look at what Flash says, it says choose a creature card in your hand and put it into play, and then you pay that cost, but if you cannot, then you would sacrifice that creature. Bury is what they said instead of sacrifice for situations like that back in the oldie days. It actually used to mean destroy without the possibility of regeneration. That's what bury used to mean. So what is the deal? Well, before, there was a time in Magic's history when Flash was printed. It was pretty early on. Here's the thing. This is before we had like a Oracle database that had like really official wordings for cards. So at some point, what they had to do is they had to like put all the ye olde days cards into like templating that was all consistent. And that was a big project. They had, probably a lot of, I don't remember what set it was where they did this in. But they did. They went through like all the old cards and they standardized the templates, and they like standardized what the cards said and specifically what they would do. And when they were doing that, basically the idea was that they wanted to, get close to the functionality, but if it was a little bit different, then, you know, so be it. And it was kind of harder too, because Flash had actually been reprinted, I believe, by this point. And so what that means is they had to come up with like what Flash actually did if you did not have the extra mana for the creature. So kind of going in line with some other cards, like for example Mox Diamond has wording like this. They made it so that if you did not pay, then you would not get the creature. And what I mean by you didn't get the creature is you didn't get the creature in play at all. It just like went straight to the graveyard. It didn't actually go to the battlefield and then to the graveyard. Now, obviously, for certain cards, like for example, Protean Hulk here, there is a very big difference in between putting Protean Hulk into play and then immediately sacrificing it versus putting Protean Hulk directly into your graveyard. Because one of them lets you get 6 mana worth of creatures out of your deck for free, and the other one does not. Okay, so when they were coming up with the wording for Flash, they had to figure out what Flash did. And they settled on, okay, if you don't pay, then that means the creature just goes away, you know, without going into the battlefield. And that was, you know, a reasonable thing to do, because otherwise Flash would be pretty good in situations like that. But at some point, Magic decided that we don't want to do power level errata like that. So we're actually like changing the card away from its printed functionality, and for no other reason than because the printed functionality is really, really good. So we're going to change it. You know, power level errata would be changing it because of just that reason. And I kind of like that philosophy. I kind of like the idea of the cards do what they say they do, and not what, like, in retrospect, we wish that they would have said that they did. I feel like that is probably a good philosophy to have. And so at some point in Magic's history, they went through all of the cards in the database, and they reverted certain ones that had power level errata. Now, most of them didn't really make a big difference. But again, with Flash, it did make a big difference. It made a big difference with cards such as Protean Hulk here. That was like one of the main cards that people envisioned it. So several years in between these two cards being printed. And what format was this impacting? Well, it was Legacy. And so when it was announced that they were going to do the power level errata reversion, there was a big Legacy tournament coming up in Columbus, and it was like some short time in the future. And so Flash was really big. It was really like widely believed to be like the best deck in the format. So as far as what the specific combo kill was, there was a couple of different iterations that people theory crafted around, with like different creatures that you could get with the Protean Hulk. Some of them were actually kind of complicated. So we go to this GP in Legacy in Columbus, and it turns out that in a rare feat that is, you know, probably not been really replicated up until Eldrazi Winter, the deck was every bit as broken as all the internet pundits were saying that it was. And Flash Hulk swept that field, took like some ridiculous percentage of like the top 8 and some ridiculous percentage of metagame share. The deck was swiftly banned, and then everybody kind of forgot about it, because there's no way Flash is going to be unbanned. Certainly it was really good when you were just comboing it with Protean Hulk and 4 Summoner's Pacts, but when you have some of the more, you know, even more years worth of cards available to you now, I'm sure you could get an even more broken deck if people were able to have access to the 2 mana instant speed I win the game card. So that is the power level errata. Now the next one is one that's near and dear to my heart, which is that judges can play Magic. Now there was a time when you were not allowed to play in a Magic tournament if you were judging it, and that makes sense. You know, it seems pretty fair. You know, if you're a tournament official, you got to be unbiased. How can you be unbiased if you're actually playing in the tournament? And you know, that makes sense for like competitive tournaments, but not for F&M. Like, if I'm playing for like 2 booster packs, I'm not going to risk my reputation being a scumbag for 2 booster packs. Just let the judges play. And I, by the way, am a big time FNM player. I love playing FNMs. I have loved playing FNMs for the past like decades now. And so one of the things that like kind of turned me off from wanting to be a judge is knowing that if I judged an FNM, then I wouldn't be able to play in it. And that was really rough. So making it so that it was possible for judges to play Magic, at least in like low stakes, you know, just for fun kind of tournaments like that. That one really was helpful for me, and I think it was helpful for a lot of people too. Judging at like those kinds of tournaments got a lot more practical when the judge doesn't have to like sacrifice their ability to play and like have fun with everybody else. And so what could be more more impactful? Well, we are up to now our top number 1 spot, and this is, I think, probably like one of the most certainly for me, I think out of the ones that I've talked about, this is the most impactful one for tournament players, and that is cheating. Right now, I want to kind of preface this by saying that like cheating was always against the rules, right? Like there wasn't a time in Magic's history when like cheating was, that's okay. But that being said, the views on cheating have changed dramatically in Magic's player base. And there was a time at the beginning of Magic's history where basically like cheating was seen by a lot of people in like the pro scene at competitive tournaments. It was basically seen like kind of as equivalent to like committing a foul in basketball, right? Like it was just like one more resource that you had access to. The number of times that you could get caught breaking the rules was a resource. That's how people thought of it, just like your life total or your mana. And so if you ended a tournament and you hadn't used that resource appropriately, then maybe that means that that's like a leak in your game and you need to work on that. That was how people thought back then. Like it was very common for people to for example, you would have to know like certain types of cheats, like the most common ones going into a tournament. If not to use them yourself, then at least to know that your opponents could be using them against you and to like watch out for, know specific stuff to watch out for. So one that was like kind of notorious around my area, I heard a lot of stories about this, would be if you could intentionally not draw a card for your turn, then maybe you would be able to call a judge at some point, and then your opponent would have more cards than you, which would make it look like they had drawn an extra card, and so that could get them in trouble. Drawing an extra card would be a game loss, or maybe even something more serious if the judge thought it was intentional. So that was a trick that people knew they had to watch out for. So you had to like actually watch your opponent to make sure that they were drawing a card every turn. And there's like all kinds of other stuff that you had to watch your opponent for too, because that was like stuff that people were trying to get away with. And so throughout Magic's history, that was like the beginning of Magic's history. That was kind of like just a thing that people took for granted, and that's the reason why. By the way, if you look through a lot of the Hall of Fame contenders have some sort of cheating scandal attached to them, because again, the like conventional wisdom was that like cheating was just like something that happens. And like, if you get caught, then whatever. If you don't get caught, then good for you. In fact, I remember hearing a story about a time when a player who was watching a match saw one of the players in the game draw an extra card, and so goes over and calls for a judge, and the judge does a card count and determines that the players are both equal in the number of cards that they have had, and so at this point both the players burst out laughing. Because they both, of course, know their own guilt. The only thing the judge proved was that they were both like cheating equally. So, that stories like that were pretty common in Magic's early tournament days. And the real thing that was credited with getting people to change their minds about this, like of course judges always had the power to disqualify people who were cheating, but a lot of the time they were kind of loath to use that power. In part because that was just like what the culture was, but also in part because like the judge program wasn't as developed at the time either. And so there wasn't like a clear kind of ethos that had developed yet around what the like appropriate response and the appropriate amount of stuff to let someone get away with was at the time. So yeah, the thing that really ended up changing people's minds on this is generally thought to be a grassroots campaign that was started by Chris Pikula here, and basically the idea was like, don't associate with known cheaters, and like people knew other people were doing this, and there was like people out there that was trying to play clean and like had good reputations too. And so like that campaign that he started was very successful, and nowadays like cheating is like actually like really frowned upon by the community. The idea that someone could like cheat at a tournament and everybody knows that they cheated, and then they just like come back to the next tournament, and especially like that they would be able to continue to play in that existing tournament even after there was strong evidence suggesting that they had done something intentionally against the rules. That's kind of like laughable now. People that I tell these stories about how ye olde days were, a lot of the time just react in shock. Like, really? Is that how it actually was? Yeah, ask players who were really playing back then how it was. And yeah, there's lots of stories they can tell you about stuff like that. Post your favorite ones in the comments there. But that is, in my opinion, probably the biggest ruling change that we've experienced in Magic's history, is cheating going from basically something that everybody like kind of acknowledged was a part of the game, and you know, yeah, it's kind of a shame, but like, you know, as long as you're playing smart, you got to like watch out for your opponent trying to do that sort of stuff. Going from that place that we were to where we are now, where the sportsmanship level is so much higher and the toleration for that sort of thing is so much lower. I think that is probably, in my opinion, the biggest ruling change in Magic's history. So that is my my pick for the top 10. If you had your favorite one get left out, definitely let me know what it would have been. Again, I would really love to make another a video of this sort, because I had a lot of fun doing research and thinking about what I thought should go into this one. With that, there's one more thing that I wanted to say, which is thank you so much to my patrons. This was a really fun topic. Like I said, I had a lot of fun with it, and I hope that everybody out there got something from it. And if you like this sort of historical content, maybe I'll try to do some more of it. I have had a few videos of similar sort on the channel, so you can find those out too. But that is all I have for you today. Join me again next time for another daily ruling. But until then, I hope you have a great day.